So anyway, as we were saying, we have the way how to translate there's some sort of input signal through some processing steps. These processing steps are nothing else but recombining the numbers in all sort of cunning way. Summarizing, multiplying, summing, finding some particular patterns and representing them in some other bunches of numbers. We were talking about that. This is just number crunching. So convolutional layers look at some sort of shortish patterns within the vectors, within the things which comes in, and create another type of signal, continuous signal from them. Attention layer is learning where to look, and again, learning where to look in this mathematical sense is literally to take how eventually it's gonna just sum all the things which come in. But learning the weights, how much weight, this is number. How much I can take this vector and multiply it by 100. That's the vector I attend to. And this other vector talking about these C's, and this other vector, which only multiply by 0.1. So it sort of disappears in the sum. This is how it learns where to look. This is all number crunching type of a thing. And you end up with the vector of finite length, vector just a sequence of numbers, 512 in this case numbers, and we have representation of the utterance. And then we can take, in a good case, we can take the mean of the utterances for the given class in this case. We were talking about classes. These numbers represent classes, dialects, languages, whatever we are interested in. Take the average of them. And voila, we have the one number per dialect or per language. That is, it all goes well. This doesn't always go so well. There is a potential caveat. I drew all of these sort of vectors here, representations of the utterances, as sort of naturally grouped by their class to which they belong, or the language group, language, whatever. Now, this is very important. This is what I mentioned at the very beginning. I shouldn't forget it. Where I told you that I'm sort of violate geometry here, because this is a cartoonish representation of that. Of course, I have some sort of vectors, and it looks like if they were sitting next to each other comfortably in this two-dimensional space on which I can plot that. But these are points in 512-dimensional space, which is, even when I do something like this, it's very misleading because it's unimaginable space. But they are points, and this is the idea: is that I just as if projected them into this two-dimensional space, and roughly, cartoonishly, sort of metaphorically, the distance on the screen here as if corresponds to the distance in this very big space. So this is a metaphoric, this is the cartoon idea. I was struggling how to plot that. People has been for centuries, maybe millennia, struggling with the idea how to plot things from multidimensional spaces to smaller dimensional spaces. Of course, some of the first people who struggled with that, I guess, are the visual artists. They are painting, representing three-dimensional space on the canvas, in two dimensions. So there are all millions of techniques when you look at the world art, how they, perspective, all sort of, camera does the same thing, figuring out many techniques. Not all cultures came up with the fine art, which would actually try to represent the three-dimensional space on the 2Ds. Many cultures came with the fine art which represent many more dimensional things in a 2D. For example, the worth, the class of the people. In the ancient Egyptian art, all the slaves are this small and the pharaoh is huge. That's another way of representing other dimension. There are historical dimensions, things which are in the past, in some paintings are smaller, things are in a present are bigger, or the other way around sometimes in some cultures. That's another dimension. So the artists have struggled and came up with solution how to project multi-dimensional spaces to to a canvas. So that's an old task. Of course, the map makers had a problem with that as well. That was, of course, the different. It was not so multidimensional. It was a spheric thing, which they have to map on some sort of something which some whatever traveler can use in order to get from one point to other. And we know, probably some of you know the history, that these attempts were more or less successful. And bizarrely enough, the most successful attempts, like Mercator projection, led to all sort of unwanted repercussions, where some parts of the globe are usually exaggerated. And on a standard map we get in a classroom, like Greenland is the size of Africa. It's just silly, Greenland is the size of Sudan or something like that. So there are all of those issues. So there is no perfect solution by definition. You cannot, by definition, project multidimensional space to smaller dimensional space. It's a lossy. You lose something, you gain something, you lose something, and you can choose. What little bit like with the language identification classifier, you can choose what you want to keep and what you want to lose. So with the Mercator projection, they decided that they don't care about the sizes, but if I remember it right, the angles correspond right. So the ship captain, if the look that on a map tells them to turn the right angle, and they turn the ship right angle, they are going to go the right direction. This is not a trivial task, but this is what they wanted to achieve. Bearing that in mind, that this is again cartoonish 2D representation of very complex system, where like what can happen is something like this, that we have actually two big lumps of these, clouds of these classes. Something like, why could this, for example, happen? What could these two clouds represent? So you have the languages from that whatever purple, I leave you to pick which I refer to as purple. Purple bunch of vectors and the purple bunch of vectors here are sort of disconnected. So what could lead to this type of a thing? We talked about this type of issue quite a lot. So this must be based on gender. Oh, sorry, on the I've spoiled the sorry beans. This must be based on the signal. Yeah, gender things might lead to something like this. For example, we will actually tonight, this afternoon in the tutorials, we will look into something like this. Now, a little bit earlier I said that, because this network is fine-tuned for language identification, it will probably learn to ignore some of these differences. But in practice, it does not always do that. Why is that? What can lead? I'm going to sort of give you some hints. This is a difficult question. It actually took us like several weeks to sort of figure this out. Why would it be? The answer is very simple, but it's not straightforward. So this is all based on the data. This is all trained. So all the way how these representations are formed, how these networks have learned to crunch numbers together, are heavily dependent on the training material you give it. So, and I can tell you that this might have something to do with the training material you give it. So this means that the network actually did learn to represent the gender somewhere in those five. They left some numerical combinations among those 512 to represent gender. Why would it do that? Why would it bother to learn something about the gender? So maybe there could be some gender-based characteristics which make differences among the languages. I don't know. There might be in some languages that, I don't know, the female adopt different register to male or something like that. That's a possibility. And I'm sure that there is a combination of effects. This would be very relevant possibility in my opinion. But this is the network. This is actually important thing to kind of remember. Like, I want to bring this forth because it might a little bit sort of clarify how these things work or get the slightly different image. So the databases might not be perfectly balanced in terms of the genders. or biological sexes of the speakers. So there might be primarily like 70% males from Swedish and 70% female from Hindi. So the network learned that these statistical biases are relevant for language identification. That's how cunning and stupid those networks are at the same time. You know, they latch on anything. They latch on any statistical patterns. So, like, it's sort of, if there was a case that there was the Swedish portion was dominated by males and the Hindi portion was dominated by females, and the network, as if I'm anthropologizing it, couldn't really decide whether it was Hindi or Swedish, it would place its bet on the gender. Oh, I have no clue, this is something strange, but it's a male, so it's probably Swedish. So these imbalances, even relatively subtle imbalances, lead the network to actually represent this type of information. And this is a sort of, I'm not going to assign imbalance to this. This is, let's say, gender-based. Anything can be, anything which, any binary feature, for example, or ternary feature, can make the network to split to represent this type of characteristics. By the way, never think of these 512-dimensional vectors. As I said, they are sequences of numbers. It never works that the one number corresponds to anything interpretable, really. It's a very complex combinations of those numbers which correspond to something very interpretable. So if you look at the database, if you could look into 512-dimensional space, you probably wouldn't see these two different clouds. You have to look at it from right angle. But there would be a combination of those numbers. Combination of the numbers corresponds. This will require some sort of course in linear algebra. Combination of numbers corresponds to the angle at which you look at this multidimensional space. From some angle, you would potentially see these type of things, and very likely from multiple angles. There could be age effect as well. You know, it learns that all speakers of Slovak are older than speakers of Czech. And those are tough languages, so I'm going to improve my score by betting Slovak for older people. So many of these things will be represented there. So yeah, this was, like I said, I didn't gonna answer, but I did. I couldn't resist. So how can we deal this type of a thing? Can we somehow, metaphorically, move the vectors around to further remove these unwanted sources of variation? Because this is what it is. This is what we were talking about yesterday, day before yesterday. These are the sources of variation which do not interest us potentially. Of course, we might want to exaggerate them if they do interest us, as a matter of fact. But if they don't interest us, we might want to remove them. So how can we do that? So how can we move the vectors for a given language dialect together? Remember, we do know those labels. We know from what language the given vector is. So this is one of those things what Priyanka was talking about yesterday, is a sort of supervised way of processing this vector space. We know the sort of correct answers for all our data points. So how can we move the vectors so that the vectors from the same language will end up more or less close together, and from the other languages, so from the same class will be as close as they can, and between classes would be as far as they can, right? Moving means technically transforming the space by, again, some mathematical operation. So one of the ways we use, and sort of comes up straightforwardly, is use some classifier on the top of this vector. In particular, linear discriminant analysis Priyanka was talking about yesterday. Linear discriminant analysis is something which, I think I have the next slide, LDA not only, as Priyanka was saying yesterday, sort of linearly delimits different classes, but, very helpfully, it also provides a transformation, formula for a transformation of the space, which turns the space so that those linear boundaries, because create multiple linear boundaries between the classes, correspond to sort of the axis of the space. So it turns it so that the first dimension is the major split among the data. Second dimension is a second major split about the data. So we transform the space that we can actually only pick several first dimensions, and we could see the structure of the most important structural characteristics which are there. And the transformation is such that it puts all the data labeled as the same as close together as possible. It doesn't really move them. This is important thing. I should maybe a little bit abandon this particular metaphor, because if we start moving things, then we lose the painstakingly unearthed relationship. It identifies the directions at which to look at the space, from which the classes, the elements of the classes are seen as close as possible together, and the things which are out of the classes are seen as sort of as far as possible from each other. It's a little bit like, imagine that you, again very little bit, because this multidimensionality really is tough in terms of metaphors, and every metaphor fails a little bit. But it's a little bit like if somebody came up, some other culture came up from, some extraterrestrials landed on the Earth, and they were looking at the sky, they know the stars, and they would go like, well, that star there, and that star there are actually in the same constellation for us. And that star there, and that star there are from the same constellation for us, and all that. They would sort of color those dots, those stars, in the constellations. And we would go like, well, this is a crazy one, like, why would you take these stars? And then some physicist or some astronomer would come, okay, I can identify where the planet is. So you would have to find the point in the space from which these stars get close together. These stars are lumped, these classes are put together from the constellation of extraterrestrians, and between the constellations the things are sort of far apart. Right? This is something which the LDA can also do. So it can transform the space, we can visualize the main direction of similarities. Again, in the afternoon, we will do these things on our data. Yeah. So it sorts the dimensions of the transformed space. Doesn't really sort, it sort of transforms them in some sense, so that the first resulting dimension depicts the dimension along which classes are most distinguishable, etc., etc. So it essentially does this in kind of metaphorical sense. A little bit like moving from one planet to the other planet, where all of these things then match on the top of each other, right? So we can do this LDA transformation if we have the language labels or dialect labels, and sharpen, essentially, the lumping of the representations of the given languages together. Or actually, in this case, lumping the representation of the utterances. We do this before we do the calculation of the means. We do this transformation on the utterances. We put the utterances sort of closer together and further together. Again, in the afternoon, we will be able to see how these things are done. And then we calculate the means. By the way, if we calculate the means, this is now drawn the way I don't remember male or female, which way was which, but the random label, there's no data. This is purely hand-drawn, by the way. So we could actually calculate the means here. What would happen? The mean is like the mean of the vector is like the vector which is like in the middle of all of them, right? In this particular case, because I just copied these things twice, so I have same number of vectors on the left, let's say the purple ones, whichever you think are purple, and the same number of purple on the right. So if I actually, in this particular case, if I calculated the mean, it would end up somewhere in the middle, but compared to all the other means, it would actually form the nice picture. The problem would be if I had, for example, many more females for one language and many more males for the other language, because the mean for this language would be heavily influenced by the distribution of the population there. So the mean would be way closer to the mean of the female speakers, and the mean of the other would be way closer to the mean of the male speakers. Now we will think about this tonight, and we will actually discuss these things. Tuka has made some discoveries yesterday, because our data, which we recorded, is like that. You know, it's crazy biased. You know, we have like one, for many languages, like one speaker, and it's either male or female. So we have no way of balancing anything. So we will discuss that a little bit later. So yeah, but anyway, we can do this, calculate the means. And of course, when we have the means, then we have the one vector now a little bit corrected, like before, one vector per dialect or one vector per language. And now we can use all sort of, so we are done. We have numerical representation of language diversity, right? We can capture, and we know that the closer these vectors are, the more similar the given dialects are, the further apart they are, the more different they are from each other in whatever features this black box captures. Done. Apart from that, like, you know, we cannot really give somebody printout, you know, that would be, if we have 107 languages, we would have to give somebody the sheet with 107 times 512 numbers. It would be, you know, some spreadsheet. Here is your answer. So that's not going to do. It would be essentially science is done, but it would really not convince anybody, you know. So we have to somehow, again, visualize that. Back to the visualization. So one way, Priyanka was talking about that, I think you've seen the same slide, how to visualize these things is to use some agglomerative clustering. As we were saying, I sort of use these colors. There are these brown, like let's say, you know, these two bluish things are sort of closest to each other. Then those two brownish things are closest to each other. Then here is some sort of purplish thing, whatever that might be, close to the blue things. And then maybe the green is so different from all of each other that those blue ones and the brown ones are somehow, yeah. So you can make this tree, Priyanka was talking about it yesterday, which captures all of these similarities and differences. Phylogenetic tree. It's one of the many possible representations how to do that. Also, when we talk about the vectors closer together or more further apart, we are actually calculating. We are not sort of looking at the colors like here. We're calculating distance between two vectors. And as I said, there's many types of distances we can calculate, many formulas. So the tree would sort of depend somewhat on whatever distance you might have calculated. Also, sometimes what happens is that, you know, we have 512. Sometimes we extract some other information from other layers as well. So we might have relatively big representations. And what might happen, however unlikely this might sound, that there is too many dimensions for the given task. Little bit like a genome. You know, our genome contains, I don't know, I have no clue, I have to make it up, contains a lot of different, those pairs of the amino pairs or whatever. And we know, and they are sort of lumped to these genes, but we know then we look at the sequence that just like 70% of that is completely useless, never read. It just accumulates there over the history. Like it sort of accumulates, there is no evolutionary pressure to kick it out. Sometimes some of that is somehow used for something, but usually there is a lot of what's called junk DNA. So it might happen in some of these cases that some of portions of that vector are sort of junk in some sense. Now, this leads me to the idea. Don't think of the vector. It's a sequence. It's a bunch of numbers. A sequence of numbers. But in general, that's a characteristic of the vector. When you compare two vectors, of course, you compare dimension with dimension. But dimensions, neighboring dimensions, have nothing to do with each other necessarily. Really, it's not a sequence like a signal. You know, something is the first dimension, something the second dimension. Doesn't mean that somehow those interpretation of those things is in any way related. Essentially what you can do, you can reorder all the dimensions randomly. Of course you have to do it for all the vectors. And you get exactly the same space. So this is where I'm thinking the metaphor of the genome, where the sequencing matters, is a little bit limping. So, but anyway, so there might be potentially, it's not very often, there might be sort of some junk information. So essentially there would be random numbers. The network ends up filling something there, but it's just because it has to fill something there. And of course, in theory, sometimes these random numbers, these random things might be randomly different. These might actually dominate the distance between the vectors. So we might use some techniques to remove them. For example, PCA, principal component analysis, which allows us again to transform the space so that we only see that we first see dimensions which have the most sort of relevant, which essentially contain the most relevant information. And then we can maybe shorten we can transform this thing, we can then now all the dimensions in terms of importance, as it were. Now, after PCA transformation, we know that the first dimension is the most important, second, the second most important, third, etc. And we can then chop it. And let's say last 100 to drop, because that's just a junk. It's just a noise, essentially. Sometimes we do things like that. How do we know? Just try. That's why it's great to have a PhD students and postdocs. You can just tell them, well, will you try several options, you know? And then they do. Or then they say, no, I don't have time. Will you do that? And then of course I say, I can do that. So, yeah. So they might be, this is not super important, you understand, but I'm just saying, what I'm trying to say here, that this might be a little bit simplified story. There might be few other steps, but we will go through those steps this afternoon. Through all of them, I think. Or we will give you the code which allows you to try all of these things. Now, so this type of clustering, hierarchical agglomerative clustering of the vectors, then leads to the pictures like this, which I've shown you before. So this particular dendrogram, this is a circular dendrogram. It's essentially the same thing like that, but it's just there's another constraint that is actually projected in a sort of a circle. Yeah, this was obtained from using exactly this technique. So what does it entail? So each of these leaves here, this is by complete accident, I hit the finish leaf. This leaf here represents a vector of which was obtained by, and now we're going to go backwards, the LDA, linear discrimination analysis transformed. No, it's the, now I'm not going to go backwards. So you take all the recordings, you obtain from the given database we analyzed, you transform them using the pre-trained wave-to-vec and pre-trained language identification network to the finite, each recording to the 512-dimensional vector. Then you do it for all the languages. This is important. Then on the resulting bunch of vectors, this was a lot of them. This was maybe 1,000 time each of these language in some cases. This is up to 1,000 recordings for each language here. But some have fewer. So this is, let's say, these 100 languages, let's say 70,000 recordings, 70,000 vectors. You take them all together. Then you perform the LDA analysis. You align them so that you remove this unwanted variation. Only focus on the variation which is relevant for the language, because you know from which language they are. So you turn it around. Then you gotta calculate the mean. And from the mean for each language, and then from those means, you get this dendrogram, right? I would not want to repeat it again, you know. Don't mean that you should have heard it by now, but it's super exhausting for me. I will repeat it again later, several times. So, yeah. So this is what's behind that. Tuka is looking a bit doubtful. He knows that there might be few other processing steps somewhere there. Maybe dropping some dimensions with a PCA, or I don't remember precisely. We did be developing this technique for about a year. We got a very similar picture very early on, but then we started sort of realizing these imbalancing things and trying to find the ways, you know, how to sort of sharpen, and not sharpen necessarily, but how to make it believable, right? So yeah. So we tried all sort of things, and then we actually ended up, and then of course you want to streamline the process. You cannot publish the paper where you say that, oh, and then we remove the third dimension. You know, you have to come principled account. So I think that we ended up, yeah. Hopefully we will be able to read this paper soon. It's under review now, so hopefully it's going to get published in next few months with this particular thing. There's plenty more analysis of these type of things. I will show you one thing tomorrow at the latest. I'm going to again do a spoiler. I will show you the one which analyzes how many actual recordings for a language we need, right? Because I said these are up to 1,000. We found out, or Tuukka found out, that what is it? 50 actually recordings per language is enough to get a robust tree. Or when you pick 50 random recordings from these languages and you compare the trees which you get from only 50 recordings for a language, you get very, very similar trees. It sort of settles. So that's good news for dialect analysis, no? 50 recordings, 50 random recordings. That's quite cool. That's why we are quite optimistic about this exercise we did here with you. And yeah.
So what's the size of data for each language?
So in this particular case, these data come from the Common Voice, Mozilla Common Voice database, which contains, as I was saying earlier, on Tuesday, if I believe, the recordings from quite a few languages. What was it, 128 or something like that languages, from in a very imbalanced way. Imbalanced both in terms of geographical distribution, so you can imagine that it actually contains, I don't know, maybe tens of thousands of recordings from English, and maybe Mandarin Chinese maybe, and potentially Hindi, but 0 from entire South America. And and then from the many languages, from many languages it contains more than 1,000 recordings. And for the other languages it contains fewer than 1,000. We happen to know that from 79 languages it contains over 1,000 recordings. I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow, but this is no problem to sort of preview that. So from 79,000 of these languages, there would be over 1,000 recordings. Recordings are whatever 5-6 seconds sentences, utterances. And they are sort of the publicly sourced, sort of crowdsourced. So they are anything. Many of them, Tuukka has been listening, if anybody, to them. There might be some just noise sometimes. You know, they're by no means controlled, no studio quality. They're not coming from one speaker. They are coming from all sort of speakers. I was talking about a little bit on Tuesday. There is a huge amount of sort of unrepresentativeness if you start listening more carefully. There is a lot of non-native speakers, as a matter of fact, represented. All the Englishes are lumped together. We have no control whatsoever what English this label actually represents, all of them together. So it's a bit of a mess. But we like it that it's a mess. Because as long as it's sort of uniform mess, it's okay. You know, if there were like half of the languages were all recorded in an anechoic chamber by an actor, and the other half of the languages were recorded on a street, then we would get a major split based on that, and would be very little we can do about that. But it's about 1,000. But as I was saying, about 50 recordings, it's about 1,000 for this particular, it's about 1,000 for this particular, for the computation behind this particular graph. But it's because we limited the number of samples to 1,000. So at the very beginning, we just took up to 1,000 samples from every language. So we sort of ignored all the, 99% of the English material or whatever there is. And I think Tuukka picked 1,000 because that was just the right compromise between losing too many languages and 1,000 first we picked because that was sort of the good, that sort of was, we thought it was plenty, we don't need more. And then we kind of started looking at whatever we can do with them, and then we kind of, because we needed to resample many times the same language, so 1,000 actually, then we picked the languages which have at least 1,000, there were 79. But I'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit when we try to sort of figure out how to apply these things for other things. But anyway, short answer, about 1,000 samples, utterances per language and less here.
So when you said 50 recordings, does it mean 50 speakers?
No.
Or like 2-3 speakers?
50 utterances.
50 utterances.
50 utterances in an uncontrolled way. Sometimes they come from the same speaker, in particular from the small languages. They might come from the same speaker. Sometimes they come from many speakers. We didn't control for that at all. The LDA transformation took control of that. So
Okay,
our
so
database was very unbalanced in that sense.
So 50 utterances can come from the same speaker.
Sometimes I guess they do, no? This is also a lazy person's method. We actually never bothered to listen to those recordings, really, you know? Only when something really popped up and then we listened to it and it was a chicken as opposed to a human, because we also chopped those recordings and sometimes they might have been something else. So if something was really, really crazy, then it like, why is this vector, all the vectors were here and the one vector was up there? What's wrong? So I would listen to it and it was like whatever, radio playing in somebody's car or something like that, you know. So there is no control over that. This is exactly this sort of lazy, nerdy person who just goes and gets the machine do as much work as possible. There is a logic behind that, you know, because we don't want to interfere. We don't want to, as Priyanka was talking about, we don't want to impose huge amount of our own assumptions. What is the right representation of the language? Is it American English? Is it Indian English? Is it Suffolk English? You know, or is it, you know, the middle class Dublin or working class Dublin English? You know, so we don't want to impose any assumptions to anything. So you know, the less you interfere with the data from some point of view, the more kind of generalizable, hopefully, results you get. This is the Assamese database. I'm not sure whether you can see this. So now with Lina, we can turn the table. Like, you don't know how many recordings there are here. So this is 60. We looked at this. I reproduced the same one from last time. This is whatever 60 locations. These are, on the other hand, well balanced ones. As I was showing you actually the balancing, so most of them are very well balanced. This probably would work it out with our LDA transform, but I think it wouldn't, funny enough, we noticed. Despite all of that, we can discuss that in the afternoon, yes. But yeah, we were looking at this earlier, and I have no clue. But the agreement was that it's okay, that there is something in it. But this comes also, this is a relatively small number of recordings, and this is now, the previous one was languages, whatever the languages are. In many cases, it's sort of passports, you know. And these are dialects. This is how people speak, with all the caveats we were talking about, how to actually elicit somebody to speak in a dialect and all that. So, and this is, you know, clustering of the dialects of Assamese. Assamese is one of the languages which I think the Vahtuveg was trained on Assamese for sure, and all these LID was also trained on Assamese, because all of these asterisks here refer to the languages on which the LID model, language identification model, remember that was only trained on 107 languages, not necessarily exactly the same as these. So these asterisks here correspond to the languages on which the model was not trained on, and it just shows that they cluster in the right way as well. So okay, so both of these foundational models we are using were actually trained on Assamese material of some sort, but none of these technologies was actually built to deal with dialect analysis. This is rather astonishing, because if you think about it in some sort of deep sense, this LID, this language identification network, was actually built to try to ignore the dialects, because it's trained to assign the sort of language label. So it was trained on Assamese material, but every utterance from the Assamese, from wherever area of Assam they came, had just the label Assamese. So they were supposed to be pulled together. They were supposed to actually learn to ignore this dialectal variation. But luckily for us, it fails, right? There stays something, there stays some remnants of dialectal variation. This also shows how prominent dialectal variation is, that it's not so easy to remove. And the dialectal it probably, I'm now speculating, this is sort of philosophical speculation of some sort, probably dialectal variation is kept because it's a sort of the same kind as the linguistic, interlanguage variation. As a matter of fact, it's something which gives rise to interlanguage variation. It's something from which the variation among the languages actually is created, is built. So if we remove the inter-dialect variation, we sort of spill the baby with the water. We kind of lose the means of distinguishing the languages because there's not a sort of principal difference. Quite the opposite. The dialectal variation is a building blocks of which the variation among the language is actually created. So this is a very important thing for us, that we of course tested it. We didn't come here to kind of hoping for the best, that we are gonna try our world languages. We tested it on Finnish dialectal analysis and it worked, so we were kind of confident it's gonna work for Assam as well, and it did. When I was talking about that, the LDA, it turns the space so that the first dimension take the most important first dimensions look at the space from the point of view which the best separates the classes. Second dimension look from the place which sort of second best separates the classes, etc., etc. So you can plot those first two dimensions. First two-dimensional, multidimensional space, you can plot. 2 dimensions you can plot. 3 dimensions you can plot, but I would need to have something where I can turn the mouse so you can look at it from the different directions. We will look at something in the 3D and 2D plots this afternoon as well. Some other type of projectors. We will actually talk about, introduce some other type of projectors if all goes well. But these are the first 2 dimensions of the Assamese data. You can see that they are quite heavily biased towards this top right corner. So it's not like some beautifully, nicely, space distribution. It doesn't necessarily correspond to the map of Assam like perfectly, but sort of does. Tinsuki are the only thing I know, because Priyanko is from Tinsuki. I know that it should be on the far east. So it's here. I have no clue where Dhubri is. West. It's in the west. And Tihu?
North of Guwahati, let's say.
Okay.
West of Guwahati.
Yeah. Anyway, Priyanko and others were looking at it and say that it's not going to be perfect because we only have 2 dimensions. We need more dimensions. But it's shocking that it sort of reflects these geographical things. There is also important knowledge that the dialects are geographically determined. There's no mystery in that, I guess. But what's actually more interesting to the point is that based on this thing, languages are also geographically determined, largely. Regarding of what the linguists tell you, no, the linguists are right as well, but the way how languages sound, in particular, prosody, phonetics, the most catchy of the aspects of the language. Of course, we we never return them, but we sort of take the words from other languages, and that's fine, usually from the neighbors. We might take some morphological things every now and then. Grammar, it's structural things, syntactical things are much trickier. Idioms, of course, we borrow. But prosody goes like that. Prosody might be the first thing we borrow. Phonotactics, phonetics, the vowel spaces are some of the first things we nick from the neighbors. Because, of course, those are the underlying thing. If we want to, we might have different languages, but we have few words. When we trade with the neighbors, we have few words which we can, or numbers usually, or something like that, which we can use. But if we use a completely different vowel space, then we can try as hard as we want, and they will not be able to actually figure out the contrast we are trying to make between 2 and 3. So that can cause all sort of troubles in the market. So, of course, those things are the first. Maybe the signaling emotional load and all those things must be one of the first things which we borrow from the neighbors. So the way how we sound is very, to a large extent, geographically determined. So goes for the dialects. Here. Now, so there are other ways of visualizing these things. For these particular locations, from the Assam. We also knew that there are sort of, cities. So we also knew the geographical coordinates. So you can then sort of map those things on a map. We have quite a few pictures like this in many other our papers on dialectal things. So with these colored, I think, by the same colors as in this dendrogram, right? So if they come from the same color, they come from the same branch of the. So this is actually sort of verifying that the dendrogram makes geographical sense. And we were talking about earlier that this point is some data mismatch, and it should be actually here, or some coordinate mismatch, and should be somewhere else. Now, spoiler. This is your own data. So have some time and look at it. So don't, of course, expect, like, imagine how ridiculously small database we have built for this, Many of these leaves are just one speaker. And of course, the sort of, this is your English, by the way, of course. All mixed together, as a matter of fact. So the average, the mythical concept of average Indian English, So don't expect any like precise thing. But behind many of these labels, you can see yourself. So when we talk about, Angami Naga here, which, clustered with Assamese, I don't know how many of the Naga students have put Angami there. So it's you too, I think, So it's not that necessarily Angami Naga somehow sounds more Assamese than, I don't know, the other Naga dialects.
So I hear some whispers going, so I just want to assure everybody that this does not mean that they are actually like that.
Of course,
This
that's
is
what I'm
we
saying,
get
exactly. Yeah.
At this point of time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is us. This is only from these databases. Those labels are not labels for a language, they're labels for these bunches of recordings. And it's always the case. On that world map, it was also the case. These were labels for those bunches of recordings. But what is a language if not a bunch of recordings? Now, I'm talking as a phonetic extremist. Language is just a union of all the ways how people speak it. But you can see, for example, kind of rather interestingly, so like, of course, I already had a placeholder in this slide for this spoiler before we even started recording the thing, So I had no clue what's going to come. And we didn't know. Like, we were kind of confident because we tried this type of analysis on relatively small data that something will come out. But, it could have been complete rubbish. Actually tried another technique on this. I will be talking in the next lecture, the technique. And actually, I don't think I have a dendrogram there because it just completely failed. It's completely random. So the fact that there is any structure here is astonishing. We cannot expect some precise and, completely perfect rendering. But first thing is that English is separate from all the other languages. It's quite amazing because it's the same people which are in these other nodes. So that's already rather interesting. And then I can see a few things that, there are some, but I don't actually know these languages, but sort of these Indo-European languages from kind of North India, more or less, or non-Northeast India are sort of lumped together here. There are some, there are some other somewhat North Indian. Well, anyway, these languages here are, all of these languages actually in this branch here are sort of non-Northeast Indian, what do you call it? North and Southeastern Indian languages, in this branch. Like in the previous, the world languages picture, Bengali was right next to Assamese, as a matter of fact. So it's not perfect, but it's fact that already there's English, and then there's a branch which separates the Northeast, essentially, from the rest of India. I'm talking for the people online, I'm talking about the branch on the right-hand side, starting from Bhojpuri and all the way to Malayalam, which is kind of the non-Northeast Indian languages, and then English is on the most left, and all of these then there is a green branch here, Well, then we have Assamese, Naga, and Angami and Assamese somewhere. But then there are this green branch, which essentially all knows these languages, if you understand it right. Whether the details between whether Manipuri and Sangtam Naga are somehow more closely related than Sangtam Naga is with the Tangkhul Naga, I have no clue. And this is not gonna, don't use this as a proof to do that, you know. You need more data. Sometimes I actually use this as a proof. I'm a Slovak, as I said many times. And, you know, I don't know if you, like, this is a very obscure place in middle of Europe, so many of you probably haven't heard about, might not have heard about that, but if you're not ice hockey fans, but when I was born in Czechoslovakia, so there's a Czech Republic and Slovakia, now they split. But it was bilingual country, there's a Czech and there's a Slovak. The languages was never merged, there was never anybody pretended to have a Czechoslovak. They are closely related languages, but there was never any unification. And I get very often a question from people who know something about the history, how similar are Czech and Slovak? They are sort of mutually understandable. Now I can tell you, you know, from these data, it's a little bit more different than, let's say, Danish or Norwegian. So all this sort of Slavic bunch, they're Polish as well. It's a lot like the Nordic languages, all of these political Germanic languages, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, whatever, maybe Dutch. So it's a similar situation. So if you have enough data, what I'm saying here, apart from that it must be fascinating fact for you, the distance between Czech and Slovak, but what I'm saying is that if you have enough data and your statistics is robust enough, you can potentially make this type of vague, somewhat underspecified judgments. You can sort the linguistic diversity. You can quantify linguistic diversity a little bit like that. How diverse is Central Europe Slavic languages? Well, as diverse as that part. More diverse or less diverse than the other parts. Something, this type of judgments you can, with a lot of apologies and conditions and qualifications, kind of make or start making. In particular, this type of things, it might be good to generate hypotheses rather than, then we need other type of techniques to verify them. We'll come back to this. So, yeah, this is what I said several times. Yes. This is one of the ways how to quantify linguistic diversity. One of the many potential ways how to quantify linguistic diversity. So in a summary, you know, we were talking about that for speech data we can derive latent representations. There are just bunches of numbers in some multidimensional space of chunks of speech, utterances, and eventually of the entire language and dialects. The core idea is the more similar these representations are, the more similar whatever characteristics of the speech behind those representations, right? On all of these levels. More similar representation of the chunks, more similar chunks. Probably the plosives would have more similar looking chunks, or the portions of the signal where the plosives occur would have more similar chunks than some parts where it's vowels. For sure, when there are different chunks when there's silence. Right? Utterance is same, language is potentially same. And then using this latent representation, we can sort of start visualizing different relationships in very many ways. Now, these are sort of a little bit of the on the side of the caution. I don't know why I stopped capitalizing that. The wave to vec latent representation capture characteristics of speech signal in a sort of holistic way. Holistic is you know, I'm trying to put a positive slant on the mess. That's an attempt to gracefully admit defeat. We don't know how they are represented there simply. They're all lumped together. Now, by adding the language identification thing on the top of that, and then applying LDA, helps to sort of bit by bit filter out the unwanted sources of variation and sort of sharpen the way how these things are representing the linguistic diversity. There's still plenty of things mixed in a bag, but we can remove bit by bit the unwanted sources of variation and sort of separate them from the source of the variation in which we're actually interested in. This is how far, well, we'll see later. This is how far we got. The rest is left for us to kind of unpack the things further. Cool. I think this is the last slide. Any questions?
But I shared you the zip file for the afternoon session for the tutorial. So
Okay, okay.
and then put it on Google Drive just like yesterday.
Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, did you send, sorry. Yeah, so Tuka has sent all of us, I guess, the similar zip file. We have a Python, what is it, the Jupyter notebook for the afternoon session, a lot like we had yesterday. We are going to run again all of these type of, and these only type of things in the Jupyter on your data. Yeah. Can you say elaborate? Okay, sorry, I will come back to the questions. Just now I finished this. So Tuka sent you in a zip file the Jupyter notebook. So do what he did yesterday. Unzip it and upload it to your Google account. So we can kind of, start analyzing these things tomorrow. So these things immediately. So we will have and we will derive that tree of your speech today. So there are some questions. Yes. From Sumimi, can you please elaborate a bit on how something like a retroflex may leave a watermark on our vowel signals, and whether that is regarded as a feature for dialect variation, and how the machine recognizes not to filter out the unwanted representation? Excellent question. So yes?
Can I just
Yes?
put in, I don't know
now
how to make this work, but anyways. So I think the question is based on the fact that when you look into your two big clusters there, they're actually formed as retroflex, having retroflex languages and having no retroflex languages. So that's why probably that she has asked an excellent question.
That is very possible. Also, I did mention retroflex at some point earlier in a talk as something which might leave some, well, I call it watermark, but some mark on the representation. So I'm just now going to go back to this picture, to what Priyanka was saying, that somewhere there is a boundary between language using retroflex and languages not using retroflex. I didn't notice that. I just picked retroflex as something, for me, for my ears, being in India, quite prominent, and a prominent distinction exactly along these type of different languages in India, because of course we don't have retroflex in just about any European languages, apart from some Norwegian variants might. So we are not used to that. So it's quite prominent sound. And I would think, and I used it as a sort of partly as a metaphor. The answer is I don't really know how precisely is encoded in the latent representations. I don't know how anything precisely is encoded in latent representations, but encoded is very likely because it's a prominent feature which is useful to classify languages. Like any other prominent feature which is useful to classify languages, it's somehow encoded in the latent representations which were driven to represent all the prominent features which are useful to classify languages. How is it encoded? I don't know. How to extract it from that? I don't really know. Although I would have an opinion on that, because you can then potentially build the speech synthesis systems which somehow use these type of representations and derive some particular things from that. But that's a little bit far-fetched at the moment. We haven't done that. So yeah, but we don't know how, but we are pretty confident it's somewhere there. We are pretty confident that something like center of gravity of the vowel space is very likely somewhere there. Some rhythmic characteristics of one sort or the other, not any of those which, almost certainly not any of those which Priyanku has talked about, the PVI and Varcoes and what have you, but some particular encoded way, in some particular encoded way, these things are almost certainly also present. As I said, I mentioned retroflex because me as a, latent distinguisher of the languages, I don't know how I distinguish languages. Well, I'm a phonetician, so I sort of do. I can verbalize the differences among the dialects and and the languages. But just about any non-phonetician cannot do that. But we still hear it. We can still tell that language sounds different from the other. Anybody can do that without having a clue that there exist consonants and vowels. People get this holistic idea. And this machine does something similar. Machine is not a trained phonetician. We do not train the machine to be a trained phonetician. So we cannot beat the concepts and the precise argumentation out of the machine. But it nevertheless can do that. A little bit like I was saying, like that this is a Martian who lands on Earth, never heard the language, but probably could start classifying the people by the way how they sound. By the way, this is a rather important thing. I should have maybe added it somewhere else, because in a paper, a couple of our papers, I guess, we cite one of the studies which was published maybe 2 or 3 years ago, on where people did this experiment, where essentially it was a behavioral experiment, when they brought students and people to the studio, played them 2 languages and asked them to judge which way they were, I guess, identify the languages. They gave them the list of languages. So essentially the human performance of these language identifiers. And they were sort of similar type of clusterings, essentially, emerged, again, mostly geographically defined language. In particular, of course, for the languages far away. Languages to which the people were not exposed at all. Their primarily classification was geographic. But of course, this was sort of, in some sense, very interesting. So our systems do somehow something similar, apart from that they have no biases. They are not sort of, well, they have biases of those training languages. So these people would speak 1 or 2 languages. I don't remember, was it in the Netherlands or where was it was online game, yes. So there were people from all around the world. So those people could tell maybe they spoke 2 or 3 languages, but our machine sort of has representation of 107 of them. So that's a difference. So this is similar thing which the machine does. Again, I don't know how many of those participants were trained phoneticians, but probably most of them couldn't really verbalize, couldn't really tell. They didn't know what languages sound different, but different they sounded. And this sounds a little bit like something they might speak in China, and this sounds a little bit like something they might speak in Congo. That's what people did. And because these different language features are somehow geographically distributed, perhaps even more than they go across language families, then this is exactly what we get. So no, I don't know where the retroflex is represented and how, but it is somewhere there. And this is the way we have to start thinking about that. That this is the way how untrained. This is not a way how phonetician would represent things. This is the way how naive listener would potentially represent things, or more akin to that, even more naive than the naive listener.